Hello, I'm Darren Jordan. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week,
we are now the #1 producer of oil and natural gas anywhere in the world. We are independent, and we do not need Middle East oil.
President Trump wants U.S. troops out of the Middle East. We take a look at the trillions spent on wars and the billions in maintaining U.S. military bases. Also this week, the hog and pork industry has taken a hit from African swine flu in China and Asia. But does the meat industry need to change to save the planet? And France's digital tax on big Silicon Valley tech that could escalate a trade war with the United States. Well, right now there are 200,000 US troops stationed at more than 800 bases in 70 countries and territories outside the United States. Despite President Trump's pledges to end the endless wars, the number of troops in the Middle East has increased. Well, the assassination of Iran's second most powerful figure, Qassem Soleimani, by a US drone strike has led to the deployment of more troops to Iraq. And while Iran hit back and tensions appear to have eased for now, a shadow war goes on, which raises the question, how much does the United States spend on its presence in the Middle East? Well, since 9/11, taxpayers in the United States have spent $6.4 trillion on wars in Afghanistan, Iraq and Syria. That's according to the Watson Institute of International and Public Affairs at Brown University. More than 800,000 people have died as a direct result of fighting. According to US Central Command, there are between 60 and 70,000 US troops in the Middle East. Well, this is just a quick snapshot of that troop deployment. 14,000 in Afghanistan, more than 7,000 in Kuwait, 13,000 in Qatar and 3,000 in Saudi Arabia. And the cost of maintaining bases and troops, including in war zones, is as much as $200 billion a year. That's according to David Vine, author of Base Nation, How US Military Bases Abroad Harm America and the World. Well, host nations do pay directly or indirectly for that deployment. After sending 3,000 troops and Patriot missiles to defend Saudi oil fields following an attack which Washington blamed on Iran, Trump said the Saudis are paying for it.
Saudi Arabia, at my request, has agreed to pay us for everything we're doing. That's a first. But Saudi Arabia, and other countries too now, but Saudi Arabia has agreed to pay us for everything we're doing to help them.
Well, joining me now via Skype from Boston is Glenn Carl. Glenn is a former Deputy National Intelligence Officer at the CIA for transnational threats. He's currently an assistant professor at Boston College and is the author of The Interrogator and Education. Glenn, the US maintains numerous bases right across the Middle East, and the RAND Corporation estimates it costs between $50 to $150 million a year per base. I mean, that takes up a huge chunk of the annual $700 billion US defense budget. So do the host nations really pay anything towards those costs?
Well, I've done a little research on this too, and the answer is a little murkier than I expected to find. It depends on which country we're talking about. Japan, South Korea pay substantial amounts, and in Europe there are substantial contributions of various natures financially accountable for the American military presence. In Iraq, I'm not so clear that they are actually making a formal contribution to hosting us, much as they are happy to have us, I'm sure. So there will be ancillary or secondary indirect costs that the host country is paying, certainly, but I don't think that they're paying some sort of a fee to host 6,000 American soldiers now in several bases.
Yeah, let's just stay with this issue of costs, Glenn, because the US seems quick to get into a war, but it's not very good at winning the peace, is it? And this all is very, very costly. Something like $6 trillion spent on wars since 2001. And here we are again with Iran. How do you see this all playing out, Glenn?
Oh, goodness. Well, that's the question that no one's been able to work out, particularly when the American political system is largely paralyzed, so that any sort of coherent, decisive action in international relations is very hard to do. There's been strong inclination on the part of half the country to remove the American presence from Iraq, which was viewed as a disaster, and yet most, I would say, professional national security officials or individuals think that it's necessary for the U.S. to have some sort of a presence there, which is independent of whether we are the ones who broke the crockery or are trying to put it together, but that to leave now would be a problem. So I don't see us leaving anytime soon unless the incoherent and capricious man in the Oval Office actually manages to act upon his impulsions.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point you make, Glenn, because President Trump says the US doesn't need Middle East oil and wants to get US troops out of the region. So what's the main reason then why the bases are still there? What are they actually doing?
Yeah, well, I think in the broad sense, the American presence in the Middle East is in slow recession. We are slowly withdrawing, I would say, from it being viewed as an existential, vital national security interest. Because it is true that just in the last 2 years, I think, for the first time since 1959, the U.S. has become a net exporter of energy. And alternative sources to petroleum are rapidly rising. So that is true. The U.S. has a less direct energy financial interest there. Nonetheless, petroleum will be central to the world's economy, political systems, and stability for the remainder of your and my lifetimes. And therefore, the Middle East is a strategically vital area. And I don't see us losing our national interest there in that regard anytime soon there.
Glenn, let's just take a look, if we can, at Iran's posture in the Middle East. I mean, we know it has proxies in Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Lebanon. But of course, let's remind our viewers that Iran is under crippling US sanctions. So how is it funding its influence and its wars right across the region?
Yeah, well, I'm glad you raised that point. It's something that we should debunk right away is the assertion that Donald Trump has made since he came onto the national scene politically, and just made recently again, he makes it all the time, that the nuclear deal with Iran Obama then gave $150 billion, I think he said is the figure, to Iran, with which Iran is now funding terrorism. That's a typically grotesque misrepresentation of the truth. What happened in the agreement was that funds that had been sequestered or frozen as a result of the seizure of the American embassy in 1979 were released. So this was Iranian money that simply was going back to them. It does appear true, however, that the Iranians used some of those funds to fund their proxies and their activities beyond the Iranian border, rather than building highways or schools. So that is true. You can always print more money, and the people can tighten their belts a bit more so that you can buy more guns. I mean, this tends to be how governments fund themselves. So those who suffer most immediately from financial sanctions and penury are the average citizen rather than the government's military establishment.
All right, Glenn Carl, we have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for talking to Counting the Cost.
Anytime.
Well, as tensions between the US and Iran escalated, our economics editor, Abid Ali, caught up with the chief executive of Rolls-Royce Motor Cars. The luxury brand was reporting record sales and has a strong presence in the Middle East, where he began by asking Torsten Müller-Otvos about uncertainty in the region and would that have an impact on the company.
I mean, that is very hard to forecast. As you can imagine, we are always watching closely what happens in all our markets worldwide. I mean, we are not immune as a luxury brand towards any disruptions like political things going on or whatever. So for that reason, we are looking, we are watching it, but I can't tell you anything on what will happen over the next weeks or months. So let's look into it. So far, I can tell you that the order bank coming from the Middle Eastern market is pretty robust for us and looks good, and we haven't seen any decline over the last days. So for that reason, it is as it was in 2019, but let's wait and see what happens.
I want to focus on climate change, and we're seeing the impact of that around the world. What is Rolls-Royce doing to make sure it's reducing its carbon emissions?
In this decade, Rolls-Royce will go electric. That's already decided. We are working on it. It will happen step by step by step. And our long-term strategy is also clear. We launched, you might remember, a couple of years ago, the 103EX, how we called it, our vision car, which was the lighthouse for 2040. And that clearly set the path in an electrified future. So we will go electric step by step by step. And that happens over or in this decade and over the next decades. Rest assured, we are on it and we are aware of it.
Now, hog production and the pork market in China were valued at $213 billion in 2018. But African swine flu, a contagious disease, has wiped out 200 million pigs on farms all over Asia, particularly in China. Well, the Chinese love eating pork, but shortages of their favorite food has pushed China's consumer price index to its highest in 7 years. Chinese demand has also reshaped global meat markets, and the government looking overseas to satisfy domestic appetites. Katrina Yu reports now from Beijing.
Pork stew, shredded pork, and braised pig knuckle. Just some of the most popular dishes served during the Chinese New Year holiday. But as families in China welcome the Year of the Rat, fewer pork items may be on the menu. In recent months, prices have more than doubled.
If prices keep going up like this, then I will order and eat less pork, or even try not eat out as frequently as before.
African swine flu has wiped out half of China's hog herds. Up to 200 million farm pigs have died or been culled since the outbreak began a year ago. Harmless to humans, the contagious disease kills pigs within 10 days. There is no vaccine.
China has 26 million pig farmers, and the industry is crucial. It impacts many other sectors, and this shortage has caught everyone's attention, including farmers, consumers, and the government.
The Chinese government has released more than 100,000 tons of strategic pork reserves to ease demand and lifted environmental restrictions on pig farming. China consumes half the world's pork, and during the Chinese New Year holiday, demand will be at its peak. To address the shortage, the Chinese government has embarked on a worldwide spending spree to buy more meat. And it's pushing up pork prices worldwide. Beijing has ramped up pork imports from the European Union, and despite the trade war, is waiving tariffs on US pork. It's also boosting imports of other meat protein, including Australian mutton, Argentinian beef, and chicken from Brazil. Agricultural experts say the pork shortage could affect eating habits in the long term. For now, pork remains China's favorite meat. But with no end to the shortage in sight, it will continue to be more costly to bring home the bacon.
Now, the whole question of how we get our protein fix has gained prominence against the backdrop of climate change. Animal agriculture is responsible for about 9% of human-caused carbon dioxide emissions globally, and with a growing population, a rising middle class that can only increase. So let's bring in a leading expert in this field. From Utrecht in the Netherlands, we have Justin Sherrod, and Justin is a global strategist on animal protein at Dutch bank Rabobank. Justin, so let's pick up on this issue of animal production. We know it's a huge contributor to global CO2 emissions. So tell us what needs to change, or are we just so addicted to meat?
Thank you, Darren. I don't think we're addicted to meat. I don't think that's the right way of thinking about it. Meat is a staple part of diets of most people around the world, in the way that you think of rice, in the way you think of bread as being a staple part of the diet. So I don't think it's about addiction. What it is about is how we're going to change the emissions signature associated with meat production and consumption in the future. And on a positive side, we start to see commitments being made by some of the larger leading animal protein companies in Europe and in the United States about reducing the greenhouse gas emissions associated with their whole supply chain. We're not seeing the action just yet. We're not seeing enough companies and as many players as we need to see along the supply chain making those commitments. But I do believe we're going to see much more of that as we move through the 2020s, the decade where we really need to deliver on the world's Sustainable Development Goals for 2030.
Yeah, and Justin, we know that African swine flu has taken a devastating toll on the pig populations in China and Asia, but it's also reshaped the international market with more exports from places like Europe, from Latin America. So what can we expect for the rest of the year?
You're right. It's had a devastating impact, and the level of devastation is something that will continue with us for over the coming years. We have never seen in our living memory the type of reduction in pork production, in animal protein production in the world that we saw in 2019 as an impact of African swine fever, and principally that was because of the impacts of this deadly disease on the pork production, on the pig population in China. This year, we are going to see more reduction in pork production in China. China, which constitutes about half of the world's total pork production up until 2018, last year saw a quarter taken from its total production. So down 25% in 19. It will be down by about 10% to 15%, maybe closer to 15% in 2020.
OK, so let's talk about your outlook for this year, 2020.
Yes.
You talked about wild catch seafood being in decline. Is this due to warming sea temperatures? I mean, what's causing this?
Look, wild catch seafood, we're talking here about hundreds and hundreds of different species across the Pacific, the Indian, the Atlantic Oceans. It's not easy to put your finger on just one thing that is contributing to year changes. In some cases, warming sea temperatures may be contributing to a decline. I'd say probably the bigger factor than that is the way that regulation around the allowable catches, the legal catches that are made, is continuing to tighten up. And we see a slight reduction in total allowable catch in some of these fishing waters.
Justin, let's just talk about the move to non-meat-based products like plant-based burgers, plant-based sausages. We see companies like Impossible Foods making a big statement in the marketplace. What's the potential for the industry here?
Well, I think there's 2 points to make about this type of product, the plant-based burger, the plant-based sausage, etc. The first point to make, I think, is the obvious one, which is there seems to be enormous attention and enormous potential around these products. And the second point to make, and I think it's equally important, is that they are starting from quite a low base. And we need to take that into account when we think about what their potential is and what their contribution is to world's population, feeding the world's population with protein in the future. As a category in general, in places like North America and Europe, we've probably seen growth of somewhere around 15, in some cases maybe as high as 20% year on year in this category. When you start talking about something growing at 15 to 20% and doing that over a period of a couple of years, it's not surprising that they get a lot of attention, and they are set to continue growing well into the 2020s. But they are still at quite a low base. In Europe, for example, if you think about this category, you probably have at the moment somewhere around 200,000 tonnes of these products being consumed per year. Now, while that might sound like a big number, 200,000 tonnes, you probably need to compare that to something like 60 million tonnes of meat and seafood, which is being consumed at the same time.
Justin Sherrod, we have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for talking to Al Jazeera.
Thank you, Darren.
Now, Silicon Valley's big tech giants have often been criticised for not paying their fair share of taxes. Much of the problem exists because of international laws that allow corporations to book their earnings and pay their taxes in the country of their choosing. But France is leading a group of nations in imposing a tax on the revenues of Google, Facebook and Amazon. And that's threatened to escalate a trade war. The United States has proposed tariffs on $2.4 billion of French goods, but the French have warned the EU will retaliate. Italy, Austria and Turkey have imposed their own levies, and the UK is about to follow, despite wanting to sign a trade deal post-Brexit with Washington. So let's break this down now with Julian David, who joins us from London. And Julian's the Executive Director of Tech UK. That's a digital technology trade association. So Julian, tech companies like Facebook, Amazon, Google, all love talking about disruption. But I mean, one area they seem to have caused disruption and controversy is this low level of corporation tax which they pay. So what exactly have they done wrong, and are they breaking the law?
Well, obviously, no company should break the law. And the problem here isn't really about breaking the law, Darren. It's about the way that taxation is still stuck in an old model. And it doesn't just apply to tech companies. It's any company using digital technology. Remember, one of the original cases that came to prominence was about coffee chains, and it applies to pharmaceutical companies and financial services companies, e-commerce, online sales companies, including obviously tech companies. So the problem here is that the taxation system isn't fit for the new world that we live in.
It's an interesting point you make, Julian, because these companies will say, look, as you've just said, that what's broken here are these rather antiquated corporation tax laws, and they're really not fit for the digital age of today.
Well, exactly. You're absolutely spot on there, Darren. That's the problem. And it's a problem of the fact that trading these days is international. All sorts of companies, every type of company is now operating across multiple geographies, multiple tax jurisdictions, and everything is now becoming more and more digital because that's what customers want. Customers want the convenience of the online world. They want to use these new tools. They want to use these new ways of doing business. And the taxation provisions haven't kept up with that, and that's what needs to be changed.
And Julian, we know that the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development was working on a fix to make the tax much fairer, but that seems to have been sidelined for now. So what's the latest with that?
Well, this is partly the problem, which is it does need to be fixed at a global level, because if not, then what you'll have is complication, people trying to arbitrate between tax regimes, which is part of the problem that's going on at the moment. And the OECD is working on it. They're due to produce things this year. And what's happening, though, is that because of the populist sort of approach to this that some governments are responding to, they're actually bringing out their own versions. Well, that's only going to make things worse. I mean, if you look at the French example and the UK example, which we've looked at in detail, both of those have got really strong problems with them, and they add more complexity and complication.
Yeah, Julian, let me try and broaden this out, because, I mean, could this issue of a digital tax actually escalate a trade war between countries? Because we've already seen the USA and France, as you've just intimated, come to blows over this.
Well, exactly. It's already clear that the US has said, look, what you're doing in France is just targeting our companies. And the example they give is advertising revenues. So what they say is, if you look at search engines, most of their revenue comes from advertising. And the French have devised a tax, their digital services tax, which just aims at that kind of revenue. But if you're another advertiser in France, you don't have to pay this tax, even though you might be using a search engine in order to allow your customers and your business partners to operate. So the Americans have said very clearly, this is just a tariff. It's a barrier to business, and you're targeting our companies, and that's going to be a problem. And we think the same will happen with the UK's proposed digital services tax. The US will say, well, look at this. This is just aimed at our kind of companies, and therefore any kind of agreement we have, you have got to remove this. So we do think it's going to be a problem. And the EU weighing in on the side of the French is not going to make life better.
Julian, let's just talk about Google, if we can, because Google recently said it would no longer use its Irish and Netherlands tax workaround. How much does that have to do with the US putting pressure on these companies to pay more tax in the US?
Well, here you go. I mean, if you can have more of a consistent approach to taxation, corporation taxation, then you will stop the kind of unusual behavior or particular approaches, the double Irish, if you will, all those kind of things that companies have in some ways been forced to deploy. Because remember, these people have a fiduciary duty to their shareholders, to the company itself, to pay only the tax that they're due to pay. They're not supposed to pay more as some sort of voluntary agreement.
Julian, let me get a final thought from you, because with more trade and commerce taking place online, I mean, how do you see companies responding to the political and social pressures even of a digital tax?
Well, here's the thing. I think companies these days recognise the importance of the communities they operate in. They recognise the services that those communities want and the contribution they should make to that. And I think that companies want a fair and a reasonable system. They also want to make sure, and we need to really focus on this in the UK as we go into the new relationship with the EU, the new global Britain, that doesn't disincentivise people from investing. So, for example, we're very worried about the way the digital services tax might be viewed by investors. If you get to a certain size an online platform. And the UK has some fantastic online e-commerce platforms, food delivery and other types of convenience service platforms. Once you get to a certain size, then you become the target of this tax. So the unintended consequence can be that we discourage the digital economy growing in the UK. And it's one of the UK's great success stories.
All right, Julian David, thank you very much indeed for talking to Counting the Cost.
Thank you.
And that's our show for this week. But remember, you can get in touch with us via Twitter. Use the hashtag AJCTC when you do, or drop us an email. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our address. But there's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That'll take you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links, and entire episodes for you to catch up on. Well, that's all for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Darren Jordan. From the whole team, thanks for joining us. The news in Al Jazeera is next.